Ford CEO Jim Farley is taking aim at cheap Chinese EVs. So he said that the shifting market for electric vehicles has made it really tough, so much tougher to predict the profitability, but that the automaker Ford needs to develop smaller EVs that can make money quickly, I think he said within a year, to stay ahead of the Chinese EVs, finding their way to the rest of the world, literally all over the world now. He said quite an interesting quote, which was, "I've been in the prediction business and in the EV business. It hasn't been a great journey." And this was what he said at the Wolf Research Global Auto Conference in New York. I think that's what it was called, if I've got that right. It feels great, he said, in the moment to say that it's going to be released in 2027 or whenever it is. But in reality, it's not anymore. We don't know when things will be released. He basically shared his experiences with making predictions in the EV sector, noting the difficulties in aligning them with reality. So he also mentioned that Ford has recently adjusted its strategy regarding EVs by postponing all of its investments, basically, which I did report on this, I think it was two months ago, maybe, and modifying production plans in response to slower than anticipated growth in consumer demand for EVs, basically. So Farley also revealed that Ford aims to produce an economically priced EV platform, so the whole new platform so they can produce a selection of cheaper, smaller EVs that could generate profits shortly after its launch, so within a year, basically. So thank you for tuning in. I'm Ben Alexander. Please consider pressing the like button for me and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more videos and keeping up to date with the latest EV news from all over the world. So Jim emphasized the need for Ford to focus on developing compact EVs that are financially viable shortly after their introduction. And I suppose by saying financially viable, he means anything other than selling only 17% of your targets, which is what happened last year with Ford and the F-150, which is kind of interesting how they were so wrong about their target there. But because it's a really nice pickup truck, I think. And I think that's on the back of last year's performance, actually, of the F-150 Lightning. So they sold 17% of their target, and they lowered their target, and I've never seen this before, twice in the year as they were going along and getting worse and worse their target. So another quote of his was, "It's non-negotiable that we're going to allocate capital to a new affordable electric vehicle, and you have to make money in the first 12 months to be sustainable. And I don't want a bullshit roadmap. I want like a real plan. And if you can't execute that plan, then we ain't launching the car." So Jim Farley, obviously, he's famously a straight talker. He said the company made that decision because the economics on smaller vehicles makes more sense for consumers. Probably does, of course. Like, it makes sense for more people to spend a smaller amount of money than, $75,000 on an F-150, for example, Lightning. He also said, what the customer has now said to us is, if you have an EV larger than a Ford Escape, it better be really functional or a work vehicle. So he also said, but if you do the economics for a vehicle, let's say the Escape or smaller, it's totally different. It's completely, it completely works. In fact, it has dramatically better operating costs than a Corolla or a Civic or even a Maverick. So I really like some of the things that he's saying, actually. I don't mind Ford. I don't sort of hold them up there with making the best cars in the world, but they're pretty nice. And I hope that they can see that other legacy brands are failing us in bringing cheap EVs to market. So Ford could be on the right track, I reckon, in my opinion. I'm just getting good vibes from them. So even after they purposefully made their Ford Focus EV, most people probably don't even know it exists, honestly. They made it very expensive. And word on the street was that it was made to be expensive so that they could sell none of them and say, hey, look, we can produce the car, but nobody's buying this car. So, and I think it was something like 30 or 40,000 British pounds. And I literally saw one ever, and that was in Norway, in the south of, just west of Oslo. And this was maybe 9 years ago, something like that. So he's optimistic about reversing Ford's current losses in the EV sector. There's some interesting numbers to mention here. So he was drawing parallels basically with Ford's past international operations, which have moved from making losses and then making them, go to profits, making profits on a yearly basis. And he anticipates challenges from Chinese manufacturers in the EV market, describing them as a significant strategic concern and stressing the necessity for Ford to be competitive globally against Chinese EVs. He has also mentioned a couple of times in the past, in the last 8 to 12 weeks, the need to compete with Chinese EVs, but seriously, because they may wipe out some legacy companies that have been around for decades, he said. So they were his words. I honestly do wonder if Ford can pull this off within, let's say, 5 years, because last year they lost $5 or $5.5 billion on their EVs, and with their EV business, they have like a business, within Ford. And in fairness, I think they largely target the wrong people with very expensive EV pickup trucks. I would say, most blokes around the world, I would argue, are blokes with tattoos and beards, and they love diesels and V8s if they like pickup trucks, typically speaking. So they largely don't care about EVs, I guess. I think that's kind of a bit of a generalization. Maybe I'm wrong, let me know. But I think it's also glaringly obvious that the typical pickup owner is not interested in spending, quite a lot more money to get the same thing but electric, even though, in my opinion, it would be better. And I really do like the Ford F-150. I've seen a couple, and I think they're really, really nice. Too big for me, obviously. It's not my cup of tea, but it doesn't have to be for me to say it. It's clearly a nice thing, isn't it? It's a lovely thing. And I always like cheap, small, affordable cars, obviously, not big, massive pickup trucks, but it's clearly a fantastic thing, especially the frunk. It reminds me of my old Volkswagen Beetle. I think it was a 1972 Beetle that I had, and I'll try and put a picture if I can find it on the screen for you. And it was really nice when you go to the shop to get groceries and then you put your stuff in the front. There's something really fun about that. So Ford reported a profit of $4.3 billion in 2023 compared to a $2 billion loss the year before in 2022. So revenue in 2023 was $176 billion, and they only made a few billion profit. And that was up from 158 billion revenue in 2022. But their separate EV business within Ford still made a total loss of $4.5 billion last year. So huge money lost. And I think that's why, isn't it? That's why they're saying these things. They're stressed about having huge amounts of Ford F-150 Lightnings that are already very big, taking up all of their dealership spaces. So also, it's got to be said as well, they had the really crappy tariff system for their dealerships. So dealerships, generally speaking, are businesses that sort of pay Ford to sell Ford vehicles, and so you can opt into a tariff with Ford to sell their EVs. I think there was 2 or 3 tariffs. One was like, I think it was £1 million a year, and you're allowed to sell 10 electric vehicles in your dealership for that year. And the next one after that was something like 1 point something million. I could be a bit wrong. I've not talked about this for months. And then you can sell more, and that was a blanket price for the US. So even if you're a small, fairly low revenue dealership in the middle of nowhere that sells a lot of pickup trucks, they would still pay huge money, the same amount of money as a dealership in I don't know, California, for example, where maybe $1 million or $1.5 million is nowhere near as big a punishment. So I think obviously manufacturers are going through this very long and complex transition period. I'm glad I'm not the CEO of Ford, that's for sure. And I think they're trying to find out how to make EVs profitable, sorting out supply chains, for example. It slips off the tongue, but it's a really big deal. I think it's a very complex thing, and delivering what customers want. That's a very hard thing to do. So I think something they are also struggling with is the cost of producing EVs is quite a bit higher, and it takes longer to get all the parts together to build an electric car than it does a petrol car typically. A little bit. There's more involved in an EV, and there are more wires to run around, for example, and it's a bit harder to install, say, the fuel tank because it's got wires all over it, and quality control checks. I think they're 2.5 times or something on an electric car what a petrol and diesel goes through during its its production phase, and that is a blanket statement. It might not be the same for all companies. So this has been very discussed, and a lot of people disagree with it. But I think it's basically been proven now that it is more expensive to produce and laborious to produce an EV. This, I think, is potentially why Tesla are putting in huge amounts of effort to, to make things smoother. And for example, they're going to take all the parts for their Model 2, I believe, which is not going to be called the Model 2, and they're going to take all the parts basically to one spot and then just build the car at that spot. So there's less space involved. Just move the little bits rather than move the car. Apparently, that's a better idea of doing it. Chuck it all together, send it out the door. So that's what efficiency. That's a big thing for dealerships. So what do you all think of this? What does this what do you think to the sound of a cheap Ford EV car? Something that could compete with a Corolla or a Camry or something like that. I think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. But what do you think? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? I don't know. I'm just wondering what sort of experiences you've all had with Ford vehicles or Ford dealerships, good or bad. It's pretty curious. I've never had a bad experience in a Ford, but I've just heard some ropey things. And how do companies approach building cars that have to compete with BYD? I think it's a very tough thing to do at a very, 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 very competitive time. I'm not an expert in the in manufacturing cars and selling them, but I imagine these days might be more competitive than it was 20 years ago. I don't know, maybe. So in the US, they can just literally stick the tariffs higher for imported Chinese EVs, like they have done, and they're probably going to do that in the EU soon, I think. But what about the rest of the world, where companies like Ford are sold? I know obviously the US is a huge market for Ford, but so is the rest of the world. So I'm curious. Ford's truck sales in the US represented 55% of its total retail volume, with SUV sales accounting for approximately 42.6%. Sedan sales, on the other hand, were only 2.4% of the total volume. This indicates that the majority of Ford's US sales are almost entirely very heavily reliant on big things, big trucks, SUVs, and that demonstrates, I think, the significant role that these segments play in Ford's finances. Within the US, I should say within the US, because if you tried selling a Ford F-150 Lightning in the UK, you wouldn't sell it. I'm pretty sure about that. So thanks for watching. Please feel free to use the comment section as much as you want. Let me know your thoughts on Ford's decision.